So I think we have an epidemic right now. I just read a study that said that 55% of millennials are clinically depressed. I'm not saying that every person who's clinically depressed is clinically depressed because of the tendency of our society to being selfish. But I'm not saying that that doesn't matter. Right. Yeah. I wonder if we've missed part of the gospel by missing God's heart towards the poor and the marginalized.
Welcome to Down to Earth. I'm Joyce Reese.
And I'm Jessica de Sabatino.
This is a show where we want to make deep theology easily understood and applied to our real lives. Here we discuss many things like the importance of story, kingdom theology of mission, the table of Jesus, becoming fully human, and much more.
We're Joyce and Jess, and we're friends, pastors, and speakers. We thought perhaps we could work on this project together and have a little fun.
Our goal is to talk about things we have passion for, connect with others about what matters to them, and together impact our world and honor God.
So today we want to talk a bit about justice. Never going to be able to talk about it all in one podcast. Obviously, there's a plethora of things to be said, but I want to just talk a little bit about embodying good news. We've been talking a lot in previous weeks about what the gospel is and how we make the gospel more than just the death and resurrection of Jesus. I'm not minimizing that, but that there's more good news. So part of that means we have to look at the bad news people live with and bring good news in contrast with that bad news and embody, the way of God. One of the things that could be said is if you look at the perspective, say, from kingdom theology through that lens, you would say that the heart of the king is central to how we announce good news. And everywhere through the scriptures, Bono's famous for saying second only to personal redemption. The second most prominent theme in scripture is God's heart for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, and the poor. So just how does that come about? So I don't know how many people listening would be familiar with the term mercy ministry. When you hear that, Jess, what do you think of?
Being nice.
Yeah, but like in a local church,
right? If you have a food bank, I think of a clothing bank. I think of
maybe a soup kitchen, right? Okay, so there are the people who go, yeah, God's heart is for those people, the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, whatever. So our church has a mercy ministry, right, and we tick that box. We satisfy God's heart that way. So it's not my thing. But we have people in our community.
Once a month I go and I hand out sandwiches
to
maybe homeless people, or I give a sleeping bag every now and again.
Right, but there are a lot of people who don't even do that because somebody else in their church community is satisfying this part of the heart of God.
Correct.
And I want to suggest that that's not okay.
Right.
That we shouldn't buck pass and let it be someone else's responsibility, like the uber extra special gifted mercy people.
Right, or people that just, I've heard people say before, well, I just don't like bad smells, and I'm kind of fancy, and so...
Right. So I always like to say bad smells smell bad to me, too.
Right.
Do you ever take a spiritual gifts test?
Right. Yes, I have.
Okay.
And my lowest is compassion.
Yeah.
It's my lowest spiritual gift.
I scored on a scale of 1 to 15. I scored 14s and 15s on things like teaching and prophetic things and wisdom, discernment, everything that had to do with anything verbal, basically.
Yeah, and on compassion, I scored 3.
Yeah, helps and mercy, I got a 1.
What's that one? There's so many iterations.
The funniest one was celibacy. I got a 9 on celibacy. I was like, is that number going up or down? But at the time, I was quite concerned. Like, it's the middle of the road. Anyway, I think I actually did that test, years and years ago, and I just thought, right, so that's not my thing. I'm not called to that.
Right.
And it took the Holy Spirit really breaking in on me. I don't know how many of us have had experiences, particularly in our 20s, where we deeply desire God. And I was one of those people, so I just really pressed in, and I prayed, and I fasted, and I really pursued growing and maturing as a Christian. And I kept saying to the Lord, I want to know your heart. I want to have intimacy with you. I want to know you. I want to have your heart revealed to me. And I think it's like Jeremiah 22 that says, isn't this what it means to know me, declares the Lord? And it's when you snatch the victim out of the teeth of the devourer and you care for the plight of the poor. I didn't know that at the time, but that became the uncovering. I mean, for anyone listening who doesn't know this, Jessica and I, when we get asked to speak places, probably the number one thing people want to hear from us is about our work with the poor. Both of us spent a good decade or more of our lives pastoring and serving in some of the poorest postal codes in Canada. I was a decade in the downtown east side of Vancouver. So something happened between I'm not called to that.
Yeah.
That we have a mercy ministry for that, and then being awakened in a different way.
I think I had a really similar experience. I mean, so if you know me, you'll know that many people would refer to me as a fancy person. I now live in Alberta, and I may be the only person in this province that hates the idea of camping. I don't like dirtiness. I don't like using public washrooms. I didn't even use a public washroom until I was 16 years old once. Oh, gosh. This is a true story. I don't like the idea of germs, bed bugs, lice. The list can go on and on.
Right.
So I was about 19 and I was living in the United States, and I lived very close to the Mall of America, and I enjoyed that existence. I enjoyed shopping there.
She loves fashion.
I enjoyed smelling like I lived there. Anyways, but I, like you, Joyce, was really trying to say, Jesus, I want to know you. And I don't want to just know you in word, but I want to know you in deed. And I was studying the book of Isaiah, and I remember reading Isaiah 58 for the first time and coming undone.
Right.
Undone.
Go read the whole chapter.
Yeah. If you'll keep your heart open to it, I just, that God will speak to you. So I read Isaiah 58 and my life changed. And the decisions I made, the places that I decided to go, the people I decided to associate myself with.
The number of times you had to come home and take off all your clothes
and put them directly into the freezer.
Yeah, in a garbage bag.
Because I still don't like bed bugs.
Right. The trenches, the real realities, getting robbed. I mean, there's a long list of things we could mention that added to our discomfort.
But in some ways, it added to my discomfort, but increased my joy.
Yeah, it awakened us to God.
In this paradoxical, upside-down kingdom kind of way.
Right.
And I would say to anybody that when you get in the heart of God, you get in the heart of joy. Yeah. So I think we have an epidemic right now. I just read a study that said that 55% of millennials are clinically depressed. I'm not saying that every person who's clinically depressed is clinically depressed because of the tendency of our society to being selfish. But I'm not saying that doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if we've missed part of the gospel by missing God's heart towards the poor and the marginalized and those that are.
So I guess part of what I wanted to say is we are not extra special people.
No.
We're people who got awakened and we gave our life in that direction. Now, whether someone listening does this vocationally like we have or not, I guess I want to start by passing the buck and saying someone else in my church has an uber special gift in that area. So they'll love marginalized people, the widow, the foreigner, the orphan, the poor. But that's not for me to do. I get to serve on the worship team, or I get to do the coffee team, or I help with kids ministry, or whatever the thing is you do. I just think that's wrong. I think all of us on some level are called to open our hearts and our lives in some responsive posture to the most marginalized, that this is the heart of God and it's how we actualize the gospel. I don't know if you have the same perspective as me, Jess, but years and years running a not-for-profit, directed as the founding director of a charity in the downtown east side of Vancouver called Jacob's Well. And in that neighborhood there, at that time, I've been gone for almost 8 years. But during my years there were 84 nonprofits in a 4 square block radius. And there are about 16,000 residents. Over 8,500 were on some sort of the care of a mental health team. Obviously, a serious problem with addictions and subsequent illnesses in the neighborhood. But there were 84 not-for-profits, and a good 35, 36 of them were faith-based. And I just saw a lot of responding to needs, passing stuff around, but not real transformation coming a lot of times through it. We might not have a lot of time to unpack all of that, but Jean Vanier wrote a poem a bunch of years ago. You think I could find it? No, but he talked about half-dead roses being thrown over a wall to the poor and calling it a gift. And I felt like a lot of times that's our posture, is like, oh, I've got some leftover stuff, so I'll give it to a charity, or I'll put an extra can in a food bank box.
I'm trying to make my closet look pretty.
Right.
So what I'll do is get all the things that are not pretty out and give it away and feel good about myself, cover up some guilt feeling.
Right. Guilt massaging.
Get myself an Oprah closet.
Right. And call ourselves concerned about the poor.
I'm not dissing the Oprah closet. I myself love the Oprah closet.
And I do not even know what it is. Okay, but then listen.
We'll have an intervention on another podcast.
So, when you've got 150 years in the downtown east side or thereabouts of addictions and Christian response, the same year the first brothel opened, the first tavern, and also St. James Mission opened. And you fast forward and you've got decades and decades and decades of similar response, Christians coming with some posture to respond to the need. I think it's important. Let's be clear. Like, you don't say to hungry people, I just want to have a relationship with you, or I want to care about your inner life, but I'm not going to feed you. Like, that's insane. But we also have to think about what long-term trajectory for justice would look like. Mercy and justice are not the same things, right? Steve Colbert and Brian Fickert wrote a book that I think is pretty important around this idea. It's called When Helping Hurts.
Such a good book.
Yeah. I think everyone who wants to think meaningfully about social justice should read it. And so we're not going to unpack all of what they said, but the idea that we could aim for something beyond just the moving around of stuff or the guilt massaging, or that we need to think of new models, that we have to think about prevention, not just intervention. I actually want to highlight one thing. I think part of why we just do mercy is because we've never thought about the need to make ourselves vulnerable. So what we want to do is perpetuate an us-them relationship. It makes us feel safe to be like what I call the doctor-patient relationship, or noble me, needy them. So I'm going to come with the stuff or the experience or the wisdom or the solution, and I'm going to, get you off the streets or get food in your tummy or whatever the thing is, give you some clean socks, and I'm going to feel good about myself, right? And it creates this downward relating. And I think to really reach for transformation will require a type of mutual reciprocity.
Yes. I also think that there is it's easier. Mercy is easier because it's right in front of your face. It doesn't require that we dig deep in our theology. It doesn't require that we actually think quite hard about things. I also think when you're dealing with systemic things, you don't get as much accolade for that.
Right.
Because it's less noticeable in some way.
Oh, I had a guy say to me one time, I was at the Vancouver Club, which is very fancy. And these,
my kind of place.
Yeah, these business folks were interested in maybe giving some money to Jacob's Well. This is years ago. It was the 15th of December, and they wanted to know what they could do, And I said, well, it'd be great if some of our operating costs could be boosted, so I could pay my staff. It's almost Christmas. We needed some overhead things to be taken care of. And one of the guys said, that's not sexy. Like, give us the number of meals we can provide, or like, we don't want to do that. And you know what? I got up and walked out. I just thought, you're talking to the wrong lady. Like, I was so grieved.
Yeah. And I mean, part of it is that we are a very showy culture. We're an Instagram kind of culture. So if I can't Instagram it, it hasn't happened.
Right.
And if I can't take a picture of it and feel good about it, then...
Right.
I mean, there's no sense in doing this if I can't be the next Mother Teresa.
Right. So the long trajectory of what justice would look like is too slow for an instant society. It's too unglamorous. Like Mother Teresa, like we look at her, but with hindsight, right? We forget about the decades of that work being unknown and untransformational because it hadn't emerged yet. I had a professor in seminary, really amazing guy named Charles Ringma. Charles asked me one day, he'd lived for years in the Philippines, and we both had significant hearts for social transformation through justice. He'd done some pretty remarkable work with Servants for Asia's Urban Poor. And so anyways, he said to me one day, Joyce, do you remember driving from Manila up to Banaue in the mountains? I said, I do. He said, do you remember how scary that road was? And so, 17 years old, my first missions trip, I'd been on this bus. This is years before I ever knew Charles. It's a kind of bus that all the windows have been smashed out, right? Like there's no glass. And you're driving along what I would think in Canada would be considered like a rutted one-lane track. And you're passing big trucks and transport trucks and buses on this very, very narrow road. And there's about a 2,500 foot drop off one side with no, guardrails or barriers. I mean, it was terrifying. But then it got worse because I just went and looked out one of the windows. And down in the valley floor, I saw burned out hulls of buses, jeepneys, taxis, and trikes that had gone over the side and exploded. Then it got even scarier because all of a sudden we would come around a bend and there'd be a huge clump of sod on the road, a big pile of, turf, and the bus would swerve toward the mountain wall to get around it, and then we'd have a narrow miss with something oncoming, and this kept happening. And about the third time, I got very brave, my 17-year-old self, and I went up to the bus driver and I said, I am terrified, and I think we should stop and move the sod. I thought a landscaping truck was losing its load, and I didn't want somebody behind us to die. And he smiled this big, beautiful Filipino grin, right? And he was like, no, I think you misunderstand. He said, somebody has put the sod there to say the road is eroding away. Don't drive over that bit or you'll end up down on the valley floor like the others. So I went back to my seat completely terrified, like we're going to die. So Charles brings us up years later and he goes, you remember that? Yeah. He said, so that's what Mercy is. Mercy puts the pile of sod and then goes and parks an ambulance, gets a fire extinguisher and waits for the disaster that might happen in hopes that they've helped somebody avert the disaster. Justice says, this is insane and we have to build a whole new road. And that's way more costly. It's like you said, like it would take way more time. It's way less Instagram worthy. We got to think about, those land survey people, right? Or the people who know how to build those huge water culverts, or somebody's got to invent those big rollers and somebody has to know how to drive them. When we get to the paving stages, we got to have people who know about environmental impact. How are we going to put a new road through the mountain? And sometimes I think when we think about transformation and social change in terms of, our response, say, to refugees or to street entrenched people or to our Indigenous persons in this nation and the horrible legacy of injustice that's perpetuated a tremendous brokenness nationally, not just among First Nations people, but the racism that's intrinsic in our culture because of it. We got to think in terms of how does that transformation come about? Right. It's a long process. We have to make a new road.
And I think from an educator's perspective, so I was a teacher at one point in my life, I think what I am concerned about when I think about this is that I think we say to people who are educationally, academically minded,
right,
go and become something so that you can give to the kingdom of God. Okay, so we need you to become an investment banker. And listen, if you're an investment banker, if you're nothing wrong with it. But I actually think we need to be putting out a new challenge to people. I think we need to say, listen, if you have a mind that works, then you need to at least consider using that mind for systemic justice issues because the world needs you.
Right.
And the kingdom of God needs the people of God to step forward, square their shoulders back and say, I can make a difference. I think often we relegate things of mercy and justice for people. There's almost the idea that like if you couldn't become an investment banker and you couldn't get yourself, then maybe you could do the world a favor and help a few
orphans
people out.
Right.
And I think that absolutely needs to change.
Bang on.
And we need to call people to the high calling of justice because biblically you can't get away from that.
Yeah. And you know what? When invitations come for me to speak for things, I always put it through a filter. And anything that has to do with clergy, pretty much I say yes to, because if I can change, or impact the minds and hearts of pastors, that'll have an impact in the church nationally and, other places. But the second category I always try to say yes to is young adults, because I actually believe they have the capacity to change the world. I feel really passionate about this because we've had a long history of the church saying well, if you really love the Lord, you'll go into ministry. Or the uber Christians or the missionaries, right? That I just hate that. I want to see some brilliant spirit-inspired
architects.
Yeah, and social workers and drug and alcohol people and government politicians and just you can think of the long list of people that would be required, like I said with that illustration, to make a new road. That's the kind of people we want involved. I'll give you a different example. Some of you will have heard this story. Obviously not a true story. This becomes very clear in a moment. 2 guys go fishing on the bank of a river. It's a hot June day, so they're, casting their lines and quietly just enjoying the idyllic sort of summer weather, kind of sitting down actually on the side of the bank. And all of a sudden one of them pops up and he sees something floating in the water. He thinks, what is that? So he jumps into the water and he swims out in a bit of a panic. His friend's watching to see what it is that his buddies has gone after. And as he turns around and starts swimming back to the shore with whatever he's got from the water, the man on shore realizes it's a baby. And so he swims to the shore with this baby, and the both of them are like, what in the world? Why is the baby in the water? And they turn around and look and they see a few more babies. So they both dive back in, leave the baby on the shore, and they, one after the other, bringing these babies 2 at a time, 3 at a time. Finally, the first guy gets out of the water, puts a bunch of babies down. They're all crying on the shore, and he starts walking off, and his friend is just in a panic in the water, says, what are you doing? Where are you going? And the other guy turns around and yells at him, I'm going up shore to see who's throwing him in. Enough's enough. We can't just keep pulling babies out of the water and never really addressing what's happening here. And I feel like a lot of my life in the downtown east side was that. It was like we were dealing with people that are in their pain and their trauma. One day, I was standing in the storefront at Jacob's Well praying and feeling quite discouraged, actually. And what's the point of this? And the Lord just really spoke to my heart out of James 1. Pure and faultless religion before God and our Father is this, to take care of widows and orphans in their distress and keep yourself unpolluted from the world. And I thought, what in the world does that have to do with right now? And boom, it came so clear. These are orphans still in their distress. And I started doing, some very non-academic research, started asking my friends how many of them had grown up in residential schools or in the foster care system. And in the hundreds, that was the narrative in the downtown east side among my friends. And Gabor Mate, he's well-regarded medical doctor, but also thinker in terms of transformation. Read his stuff. I started reading some of his work, and part of the research that came back was that if we could get to kids between the ages of 0 and 3 that were from high-risk situations, we could stop what has become neighborhoods like the downtown east side. That we had to go way back. That's where the babies got chucked in the water, right, so to speak, right? So I want people who will think way out of the box. That's why I bring this up on the podcast, because I'm really hoping there's going to be some young adults that are listening going, I'm gonna tackle.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the Northwest Territories this weekend, and I must have met 4 or 5 senior couples too. So this is not just a call to young adults. True. This is a call to all people. And I met 4 or 5 senior couples who had given up their businesses. They all ran very successful businesses, gave them to their children, and then moved their entire lives to the Northwest Territories to live amongst the people there. I'm blown out of the water that people would do that. And they were seeing great, great results, because when people give up their lives, the world turns and says, what? Why would you ever do this?
Yeah.
And so I think on both ends of the spectrum, there are people that can change the world. I don't think it matters how old you are, where you are.
Right. So part of what we have to do is we have to listen to the Holy Spirit, and then we have to begin what I call baby steps, And I always say justice has to be personal before it can become communal, or it has to be on an individual level lived before it can become systemic in its addressing of, systemic injustices. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I always think one of the best ways to go about this is to figure out what's the bad news people are living with and then bring a good news announcement. Right. So if you don't know any of the bad news, very simple thing to do is go to your local social services office and ask what the felt needs are in your community. That's just like basic diagnostic. They never know what to do with us. When I moved to Abbotsford and I asked for an appointment and they wanted to know why, what was it regarding? And I said, well, I'm a local pastor. I've just moved here and I just want to meet with someone who can tell me what the felt needs are in the city. So do we need breakfast programs in elementary schools? Are kids going to school hungry? Do we need more foster parents? Do we, need people to help people with disabilities getting from A to B? What are the felt needs? Do we need more people to sponsor refugees and support them in their year transition into our culture, right? Yeah. You know how long it took me to get an appointment? It took me over 2 months. And when I finally sat down with this guy, he was the intern that it had been passed off onto. And he was blown away. He said, no one from the church has ever come and asked. So I just think that's a beginning spot.
Yeah, I think we have in Canada, in the United States, there's really good government agencies that can help answer those questions. I think the police station is always a good place to go as well.
And local schools.
Yeah, when we worked in Toronto, we would often work with the police and they would say, listen, if you can help this group of kids that lives here, you will make our community a better place to be. We'll be putting less kids into juvie. Yeah. And quite frankly, you'll be making our lives easier. And, that's part of it too, right? Making the places we live and work better places to be.
Right. So give an example, Jess, of what you guys were doing in Toronto.
I mean, I told the story in the last podcast of those two little twins who were wild. I don't know if I even told this on the last podcast, but they were so wild. They had learned via YouTube, this says YouTube, just the dawn of YouTube, the dawn of the wonderful things, how to make a little bomb. So they went to your local Canadian Tire and they got all the components and they would make these little bombs and throw them into people's balconies. So you can imagine this, you're going out to grill a nice little steak or pork chop and somebody is throwing like a smoke bomb and it's these two girls. And so the police came to Dave and said, you got to help these two little girls. They're going to end up in juvie. And, that was an easy way for us to just build friendship with them. I fed them breakfast in the morning sometimes. We fed them a couple times a week. We made sure they were in all of our programs. When they were running off the rails, we'd be saying to them, no, you can do better. And I mean, it was just friendship building.
Right.
So all of us can do that. That didn't take any kind of
It was opening your door in your lives and being present to kids in your neighborhood.
Laughing with them, joking with them, just regular stuff. And anybody, and a lot of young adults in our community, and I told this story, a lot of young adults took that challenge up. Right. Just began building friendships with people. It's as easy as building a friendship with people. And that just came because we decided we talked to our MP, we talked to our MPP, we talked to the police department, we went to all the social service agencies. And if they'll see you as a partner and not like you're trying to take them over, you're just trying to assist and help, I think that makes a big, big difference.
Totally. I think in our context, in the downtown east side, we were in a particular neighborhood that is, sort of legendary in its concentration of marginalized persons. So we had to get a different kind of lens and imagination. I sometimes feel like we have the luxury of not having to do a soup kitchen because you could get fed 7 times a day in the neighborhood. Right. You could get a shower and a shave. In fact, a bunch of my friends never ever did laundry because they just throw their dirty socks in the alley and then go and get more free stuff. So probably part of what had to happen for us is we had to figure out how to not to just shovel stuff around and find a different way to respond. And so one of the most profound things we did is we did a shared community meal on Tuesday nights, which looked very different than a soup kitchen reality. It was nobody standing on a street corner passing out hot dogs, go sit over on the curb and noble ass needy you kind of posture. And I'm not slagging that. People are hungry. People need to get fed. But we had the luxury of thinking of a new way. So we did something called Community Kitchen. We learned about it from the food bank. And they intended for it to work, in small apartment buildings where like 6 people would cook together and help each other and share groceries. Food goes further when you eat together, right? And then also learn nutrition and cooking skills from one another. And I don't know if you've ever had to cook for 1 or 2, but it's more fun if you do things in community. Well, we just borrowed that. My friend Andy learned about it, and then he was like, we got to do this. But we did it for our neighbors upstairs. So 84 tenants in the Jubilee Hotel above the Jacobs Well storefront. Now, not everybody would come to dinner, but you'd get, sometimes 30, 40 people, and we'd have about 6 or 8 people round a table, family style, and we all cooked together. And that was an interesting process because we didn't say like, oh, no, we do the food and you come and you eat and we serve you. We all did it together. So I remember one day, a couple guys coming in and our friend Jeff, who we knew from living upstairs, just said to him, hey, Jeff, do you want to help like peel potatoes or cut some onions? What would you like to do? And he just looked at me and he said, I'm not allowed to touch knives. And I was like, right. So you could do chairs maybe. And then Jeff's thing was chairs. Like you couldn't take that job away from him, It was like as long as he lived in that building, he would show up to do the chairs. And I remember one of my friends, my friend Todd, he wouldn't mind me at all telling you, like it was profound for him to get to do the dishes or to chop the onions. And one day I found him crying while he was doing the dishes. I was like, what's going on? Are you okay? And he was like, it's just such a gift. It makes me feel like I am in a family. So there was no us and them, right? One of our friends, Frank, it turned out mental health team came and asked us on a Wednesday after our Tuesday night dinner, like they wanted to know what we had done to help him, to heal him. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm in the dark here. I don't know what you're talking about. And they said, well, he came into our office today talking and he said it started at your dinner. And I was like, you mean he never talks? So the guy had been mute for something like 18 years. And I had no idea. And it was connected to trauma and his mental health that had subsequently been, obviously wounded by something that had happened to him. But these mental health workers were like, how did you get him to talk? And it was because we created a pass the potatoes reality. And so one day Frank just said, can you pass the potatoes? You can't stop the guy now. I ran into him when I was in the city 2 years ago in the spring. I was walking through the neighborhood and just hoped to run into some of my old friends. And there was Frank. And he said, oh, I haven't seen you for a long time. Where you been? And I said, I moved to Calgary and I heard you had kids. You got any pictures on your phone? And so we just ended up having a really lovely chat. And I thought how profound that I would run into Frank, right? But we had to get an imagination. We had to think, okay, how does it look different in our context? How can we reach for more like justice? And it had a lot to do with mutual reciprocity. I want to bring up John McKnight. He's the guy that's famous for teaching people asset-based community development, or ABCD. So part of what's happened, in our reductionism, our mercy model, is we just think in terms of needs. Mm-hmm. But John McKnight very wisely and astutely started thinking in terms of assets. Right. So, he started saying, well, what are the gifts in the people in your community? If you see someone only as broken or needy, you'll never see transformation. Right. But when you can see their gifts, you can see something else emerge.
Yeah, I think we saw this in a really real way when we were in the city in Toronto. Because I think everybody around us, we lived in a neighborhood, tons of children, hundreds and hundreds of children. Right. And so you begin wondering, and children who, by and large, were not going to go anywhere. More than 60% of the kids in our neighborhood never made it through high school. So really high dropout rate, really high early pregnancy rate. And so we just began to ask, what do these kids love to do? Because you always lean into people's strengths. Right. Instead of saying, what don't they have? What do they love to do?
Right. What are their gifts?
Yeah.
Passions?
And, there are a lot of people in the city doing things like basketball leagues. And, we thought, well, we could do that. But what else do they love to do? Because that only hits a certain segment. And we realized they love to dance. And they love to be joyful. And they love to sing and rap, and usually not really awesome raps, but,
but they
still like to rhyme. Swear words do rhyme a lot. I understand the pull. So anyways, about a couple of years after being there, we thought, well, what if we started like a little singing and dancing group for them? Maybe that would give them a skill and they'd feel good about themselves. And we were very aware. See, this is the thing. I think whenever you're talking about justice, you're not going to fix the whole world.
You're not going to fix.
No.
We're called to love.
Yes. So, but you can do things that are justice oriented that would be more than just giving them a hot dog, but that would actually give them a skill and would help them to grow in their academic world and, get them out of here. So we started this little group, and I was hoping, like if 10 kids came, that would be awesome. And maybe they could really sing. Well, the first week, like 10 kids came, but none of them could sing like in the key of Z, Joy. It was like the worst singing. I think we sang like Mary had it was A, B, C, D, and it sounded like A, B, C, D. It was the worst singing. I wanted to cry, not tears of joy. The next week we had about 25 kids. And they still couldn't sing. And I thought, and I have no clue. Truthfully, I mean, I can sing a little bit, but I'm not cutting an album anytime soon. You don't want me to sing.
You did have a rap album.
Yeah, so you don't want me to like sing anywhere publicly. My children will attest to this. So I sing in the shower. I don't know. But we thought this is their asset. This is what they can do.
Yeah.
So if you know me too, I can't dance to save my life. I can do a mean Running Man, not the new Running Man, old school Running Man. Yeah. But it was about them. It's never about us. Right. It's never about us. So anyways, about 6 months into this, we had 100 kids coming, and man, like God just did something really cool. You can find, and so then a couple of years later, we did an album and we were nominated for 4 GMAs. And I will be able to tell you that of all those kids, like 80 or Gospel Music Awards, sorry.
Canada,
yeah, thanks, Joyce. Of the kids that were in that, about 90% of them have gone on to post-secondary education, have, busted out of the cycle that many of them were caught in.
Because they were seen as successful.
Yeah.
As gifted.
They thought they were all going to Hollywood. This is in the era, like the height of American Idol. So, I mean, part of it is you have to look around you and say, how can I lean into what somebody else is into?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's what every good justice worker does. They lean into it's not about you. It's not about what you like or the smells you like or it becomes about the people that we're serving. And that's what Jesus was talking about when he talked about being a servant. He wasn't talking about taking the last piece of cake or standing last in line. I mean, he was. But it was more about leaning into the people that are around us and saying, what are you about?
So we even see this in the John 4 narrative when Jesus has this conversation with the woman at the well.
Right.
She gives him a cup of water first.
Right.
Like there's something about him needing something from her that opened the dialogue. I think we minimize these things. We just go, yeah, that was the beginning of the conversation. We overlook how profound that is. I had an experience a bunch of years ago. My friend Michael Spears has given me permission to talk about this, but Michael lived upstairs in the Jubilee Hotel and he always hung around on the street, but he would never, ever come into the Jacob's Well storefront. And his reason was, because we were pretty candid about it. I'd invite him in and he would say, oh, I'm not going in there. It's a religious place. And I was like, dude, like, you've never been inside. Like, we're not going to bite you. Like, come and have a cup of coffee or nope, wasn't doing it. So I always just chatted with him outside on the street. Of course, in a neighborhood like the downtown east side, a lot of people don't realize this. Like when you live in a 10 by 10 room and many people don't have a window, the street is their living room. And you have to be respectful of that. Just as this is totally for free, but like if you're walking through a neighborhood, just be respectful of the fact this is their living space. So if someone opened the front door of your house and like marched in and had a little look around and opened your cupboards and checked out what you had in the closet and then went out the back door, you would be like, what the? Right? So this is how people feel when we do what I call Christian tourism in street entrenched neighborhoods where there's a street entrenched population. So I would stop by Michael's living room most mornings and chat with him there on the street. And one day, it was a Friday, I'll never forget it as long as I live. He and I were having a little natter. I asked him how his day was going and what he was up to. And he asked me kind of what I was going to be up to that day. And I just said, people give their crap to Jacob's Well, that the half-dead roses thing. So we've been given a computer that somebody thought might be nice for poor people, but isn't necessarily nice for them anymore. And it's broken again. And like, I've only had the thing 5 months and I've had no end of problems. And now it's eaten a bunch of my work. Got to figure it out. Now, if you don't know me, the one thing you got to know about me is I'm a Luddite. Me and technology.
True story.
I'm waiting for my husband to come home from Europe. He's on tour right now, and he is my tech department. So there's a number of things that are on hold until he gets back. Well, back in this day, I didn't have a husband. I had no tech department.
You were
so
9 on the celibacy.
yeah, I was like 9 on the celibacy, and I had a broken computer that this is just uber hopeless for me. So Michael said, I might be able to take a look at that. And inwardly, he knows this. I scoffed. I just thought, right. So, but I just, all of a sudden I had this thought like, well, maybe he'll come in. It was almost a game in my head to see if I could get him in the door. So I was like, really? He's like, oh yeah, I know a thing or two about computers. So, sometimes when people haven't been listened to for a really, really long time, and a lot of street entrenched people are never listened to, they seem quite braggadocious because they kind of have to up the descriptions of their awesomeness because they feel ignored and unseen. So I just thought this was what was going on. I just thought he's like, he probably knows how to open a Word document, and he's like telling me he can read in DOS or something. Anyway, he did. He came in, and I set him up in my office, in my desk, and I said, well, I'll just go make some coffee. And he'd asked a couple questions, what document I needed. Like literally the thing wouldn't boot, like it wasn't working. I come back a few minutes later and the whole thing's streaming in DOS, and he goes, is this the document you're looking for? And I can see like the title. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, yeah, I'm going to have to take your computer for the weekend. I got to build a new E drive or F drive. I'm going to have to put on a no operating system. And like, so we're in the downtown east side, and he lives in a single room occupancy hotel. And he's telling me like, it's a crap computer, but it's the only one I got. And he's saying, I got to take it for the weekend. Smart people say, no, that's not happening. Broken computer is better than no computer. Cause like, I didn't know him super well. Was he going to go sell it on the street? So I had this choice right then. Like, am I taking the cup of water from him? And I thought, I got to trust him. It was an assets-based community development moment that Jesus brought to me. So I just said, all right. So we had a cup of coffee together. He took the computer, and you know what happened. He came back on the Monday with the repaired computer that actually worked then for me for about another 18 months. And in that time, we got enough money, we could get a better one. But Michael became a permanent fixture in the community. In fact, for a long time, there was a certain chair in the front room that was his chair. If he walked in, whoever was in the chair got out because it was Michael's chair. We also discovered he's an incredibly gifted cook. And so whenever we would run weekend workshops or we had immersion learning teams that would come, Michael would cook for, he'd be the head chef and we'd all be his sous chefs. And the most amazing food. Such a gift. This quietly became his entrance into the community and eventually into the Strathcona Vineyard Church. And, they had their 10th anniversary a couple of years ago, and Michael cooked, of course, for the big party. He emailed me like he did ribs and coleslaw and mashed potatoes, and they had a feast. It brought dignity to him and belonging, but it also brought gift through him, right? And I always love the story of Ruth in the Bible because good news didn't just come to Ruth. It wasn't like, oh, you're a widow and you're a foreigner and you're poor. Okay, well, we'll give you some leftover barley and leftover wheat during the wheat harvest. Yeah, that was the beginning posture, was to make provision for her. But God saw good news coming through her, not just to her. And of course, we know, you fast forward to Matthew 1, she's one of the great grandmothers of Jesus. So I think we've got to get our lens turned around a little bit. I know we're hitting some broad strokes here, but I would love for us to be people who see the gift in people, not just the curse on people or the capacity, the goodness in them, not just their bad news, but how transformation can be through their own participation, their own narrative, and how we can be changed by that. It's mutual. Like Mother Teresa always said, I don't go just to bring good news to the poor. She said, people fail to understand. I go to meet Christ in the poor. And that's a very upside down lens, right? So we can be changed. We are changed. And we need that. We are saved. We're being saved. We will be saved. Well, I'll tell you what. I have been more saved by my shared life with marginalized people than any other experience in all of my faithful years of trying to follow after Jesus. Can I tell you one more story?
Yeah.
We used to tell people, when you think about diagnostics, bad news, good news. We used to tell people, the end of a weekend workshop where we teach some of this stuff, we'd send them out into the downtown east side to look for two things: what's missing and where's God present. Mm-hmm. And so they're doing both, like it's sort of asset-based and needs-based lens. And it was always very profound in the debrief, the things they would come back with. And then at the end of it, we would say, okay, great. So now that you know how to do this exercise, we want you to walk in your own neighborhood tomorrow, the next day, and do the exact same exercise. What's missing and where's God present? And see what the Lord shows you, because these things that we talk about are not just for neighborhoods like the downtown east side. They're for everywhere we come from. Now, I live in suburbia right now, which is actually kind of hard on me. And it's been good, and I'll probably talk about that more another time. But I am an urban city center woman. I want to be with the urban vitality, the core, the essence of an inner city life. So we're trying to figure out where we'll land when we finally buy a house. But anyways, I had a guy do this weekend workshop, and 3 years later, he came to me and told me the story that came out of that statement at the end of the workshop. He just thought they're just lovely young adults who are really naive, because he came from West Point Grey in Vancouver, which is like very, very wealthy neighborhood. And so he thought, there's some idealism. Like, I can't do this walk in my neighborhood. There are no needs. And I'm certainly not going to be able to see where God's at work in terms of social justice. So he sort of scoffed at it. I think he was in his early 50s. But obviously, he came back 3 years later to tell us something for a reason. The next day was Sunday. He was walking his dog. He just all of a sudden heard me say, do this walk in your own neighborhood, and ask these two questions. I dare you. And he heard that in his head, and he thought, okay, fine, I have to walk the dog anyway. I'll humor myself. And for the very first time in his life, he saw the Filipino nannies everywhere in his neighborhood. And it wrecked him. The Holy Spirit just pushed and highlighted that. There are Filipino nannies all over this neighborhood. They're the working poor. They're right here among you. So he went home and he told his wife, what do you think we do with that? And she was like, I don't know. What did you learn at that workshop? He's like, well, you got to reach for relationship. So they started walking their dog the same route, and they started noticing that a lot of these nannies were hanging around at a playground. And there was a little dog run there, so they started bringing their dog there, and they asked the Holy Spirit to highlight the one nanny that they should try for a relationship with. And they did. They found this one woman that they just regularly saw. They got to know her, found out her name, introduced themselves, started talking to her, found out she got Thursday nights off. It's the only time she got off in an entire week. I don't know how many people listening are aware that a lot of the nannies that come to work in Canada are basically like indentured servants. They earn about $800 a month, not a week, a month, because they get their room and board for free. But they work from sunup till sundown. They usually get one evening off a week, and that $800 they earn, they send back to the Philippines to support their own children and their extended families that they're away from, looking after someone else's children so that they can survive. It's really, really tragic. In fact, the other thing a lot of people aren't aware of is that many nannies, particularly Filipino nannies in Vancouver, have found secondary employment as prostitutes on the naval ships coming in to harbor. And so there's a number of people trying to find ways to help them get out of poverty, because that's the only way they're helping their extended families survive. This is a justice issue, okay? So anyway, this guy and his wife started building friendship. It took, I think, about 6 months. And then they started having her over for dinner, started learning about her life and realizing she had children and this beautiful family at home. They started uncovering how much she was earning, and they were appalled. And so they asked her why she didn't apply for a different job in Canada. And she explained the limits to her visa. Long story short, that family sponsored her to become a Canadian citizen. So they had to ante up and say, for the first 3 years that she lives in Canada, if she has any financial need, we will provide. She can't go on welfare. There's a number of caveats. I know, because I had to sponsor my husband, right? When he married me, I had to sign on that I could provide for him for the first 3 years.
He's on his own now.
Yeah, now he's thinking about becoming a citizen. It's only been 11 years. But anyways, so they reached for her transformation. They sponsored her to become Canadian, which meant she could get a different job. She could earn thousands of dollars a month instead of 800. She could have her husband and her children join her, sponsored her mother as well to come. That whole family came out of poverty and were able to provide way more for their extended family in the Philippines. She was already here, just the provision wasn't adequate. In the next podcast, I'm going to tell another story about Patrick, the chicken farmer. You got to remind me. But we've got to be good question askers. We got to learn to see what's in front of us. We've got to find ways to engage with the heart of God and make room in our own homes, at our own tables, this sort of symbiotic relationship.
And I think the hardest part about this is the getting going.
Right.
So I think, like, I know this. I have 4 kids and a husband and 2 jobs. And there are moments even in my own life I think, I don't have room for this. I don't have room to breathe. I barely have room to, like, show up to a soccer game with my kids or a basketball game. But I think this is the way of the kingdom. I think when we make room for the justice of God, that it makes room for us. Right. And I don't really know how that works in terms of how it's a little bit like giving. It's giving, right? It's giving of ourselves, that we'll always have more when we give. Yeah. So maybe you're listening to this going, yeah, nice. When I stop working 90 hours a week. Yeah, but I would just challenge you to say, where can you do this? And just even get your foot in the door. Because if you get your foot in the door doing something small, then God will make room. Yeah. God will make room for you, and he'll make room because it's his heart.
Yeah. And it's what you said at the very beginning, Jess. It adds joy to us.
Yeah.
It leads to our own flourishing. So go for it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Down to Earth. We hope you've enjoyed listening and feel inspired to grow in your relationship with God and to engage your life in ways that shape your culture and community.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment and leave a review on iTunes. Not only does it let us know how we're doing, but it helps other people find the show. Remember, if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please leave them in the comments on this episode at downtoearthpodcast.com.